Hi, my name is Sophia Romanov Imber, and I'm the Associate Editor of The Sun.
Hi, I'm Paul Caruso. I'm a second year MPA and a senior opinion columnist at The Sun.
Hi, I'm Leah Badawi. I'm an opinion columnist at The Sun, and I'm a junior studying government and English.
Please briefly summarize why you believe The Sun shouldn't endorse SGA candidates.
Yeah, of course. The editorial board endorses SGA candidates based off of an interview that they conduct after the debates that the SGA holds. And they make a determination on whether those candidates embody the values that the editorial board says are the values of the Sun. And we think that they shouldn't for several reasons. The first being that being a candidate for the SGA or in student government in general at a university allows students to have an arena where they can mess up and they can go on with their lives without that following them necessarily. This is the nature of college in general. It's the reason why universities are so attractive for students across the country to go and mess up or even change their opinions. If I had a nickel for every time that one of my friends went to college and changed their political opinions, I would have at least 5 nickels. And so we think that letting students be students is probably the number one reason why. But we also have other reasons, another being accountability. The Sun is the only newspaper at Cornell, and it does a great job. However, in the off chance that the editorial board either behind the scenes or formally censors its opinion writers to not put forward a different kind of endorsement, those opinion writers don't have another place to go to. Now, that's not currently the state of affairs, but it's still a risk. Further, the editorial board is speaking on behalf of the entire Sun. It's not speaking on behalf of just itself. And that's an important distinction, that the editorial board doesn't ask any opinion writers their opinions on who the Sun should endorse.
Another reason why the Sun shouldn't endorse SGA candidates is because it doesn't do the same for the other assemblies in this university. There are many other assemblies, including the Employee Assembly and the Faculty Senate, which the Sun's editorial board doesn't reach out and interview. It only interviews the Student Assembly. And we think that if you do want to start endorsing candidates, you might as well go all across the board instead of only focusing on the Student Assembly, considering that the entire university reads the Sun. And on that point, there are going to be a lot of people who are reading this endorsement and just going off of what it says. And there isn't really anything to say that the editorial board's standards and knowledge as opinion editors and associate editor is superior to somebody else's or some other organization's endorsements. Organizations like the YDSA, the Cornell Republicans, and the Cornell Democrats, they all endorse candidates, and rightfully so, because they are political organizations. The Sun has this history of doing editorials, writing about stuff like the referendum that passed in 2024, if I remember correctly. But the Sun itself is not necessarily, or it shouldn't be, a political organization. And like Paul said, the possibility of having this endorsement process also opens up the possibility of certain biases going into what candidates are chosen for. Yeah. We touched upon in the article how a lot of people who were running for student assembly were asked about their opinions on geopolitics, like the Palestine and Israel conflict, for example. And though I do personally believe that it's important to ask these questions, I do think that it would be more productive for the Sun to interview candidates and inform the student body of general information regarding each candidate's viewpoints rather than endorsing a candidate based off of the political ideas that they hold personally.
And I agree with that. The interviews that are conducted after the debates are not made public. The questions, we don't know what they were exactly, apart from what the candidates themselves have told us. and the answers aren't published in full either. So, that could be one alternative to the current method, is to publish those kinds of interviews publicly, or even to make them more focused on what the debates are actually about, which is about the job descriptions of the actual role that they're taking.
Yeah. So if the editorial board were to change its endorsement selection process, were to adopt some of these changes, would you be open to reconsidering your position about our endorsements?
Personally, it depends. Depends on the type of change. I think some of the stuff that I just mentioned, with maybe changing to a more strictly informative format, I'd be open to, but at the same time, I feel like being informative also does not necessitate an actual endorsement.
Personally, I don't think so. I don't think the Sun should endorse any candidates for any assembly. I feel like that's sort of something that should just be left for students to figure out for themselves, especially because, again, the Sun is probably like a 95%, 99%, like has a monopoly just over all of the news at Cornell. Like, it is the premier news source here, and I feel like it should just be left for people to decide it for themselves, or for opinion writers. And yeah, if you want to take the informative approach, I feel like it's not necessary to endorse a certain candidate. It's more necessary to inform people about what beliefs each candidate holds, and then let them go off of that in choosing who they think is best to be elected in the student assembly.
Now, there are undoubtedly students on campus who will vote in the election based on, well, frankly, vibes. They will base their vote on just some headlines maybe they've read, or word of mouth from their friends, without putting much thought into the policies or agendas that this candidate is putting forth. As Cornell's only newspaper, a monopoly, as you call it, do you think that the Sun should be working to counteract this attitude? And if through not endorsements, but rather a clear set of standards or a more informative process, how do you think the Sun should approach this? Because I know we're talking about being more informative, or talking more about these debates, but how else should the Sun do it? Because there will always be students who vote without much thought into policies or agenda.
It's a good question to ask. I will say I think it comes from the point of view that the editorial board is the exception to the rule, that the endorsement of the editorial board is not based on vibes, where the argument could be made, although we don't make it ourselves, that the editorial board has its opinion and it's conducting these interviews, however, to justify its own opinions. The methodology is not public that the editorial board uses, or the entire process. And so I don't think it actually does much to counteract voting on vibes. More so, especially the way that the endorsements come out, the way that they're written, it more encourages just voting based on whatever the Sun told them to vote. And I think that sometimes the articles are written in ways that would assume so. And that, I think, is the problem that we're trying to get at. People voting on vibes is, I encourage everyone to do their civic duty and research the candidates. And I think that the debates are a great place to do that. And I think that one way that we could change the process is if the Sun elevated those debates and the substance of those debates, so that as students are pitching their ideas on how to improve student life to other students, that the Sun is acting as the megaphone, not as just shaping the conversation itself.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I also think that there's more so a participation problem than a vibe problem. Most people that I know just don't vote in the student assembly elections, or vote if they have a friend who's running, or somebody tells them to vote for somebody. And that's even been the experience for me. I don't really find myself, researching the candidates that much, because I feel like the entire campus is kind of demoralized, considering just like pertaining to the student assembly. Yeah, so I feel like the Sun should definitely try to encourage participation, and just like showing up to the debates as a way for people to get more involved with the student assembly elections, rather than picking one candidate that they believe is the end-all best candidate for the position, based off of an arbitrary set of reasons for why.
If the Sun, as a newspaper and as an organization run by students, and don't you think that there is almost a responsibility of the Sun to not only be a megaphone, and to elevate these ideas, and elevate these processes about the debates and everything that's happening in the election, but also to be a guiding hand regarding if someone wants to cast a responsible vote. Because as you said, people do vote because their friend tells them who to vote for, or just because maybe they see online like a campaign and it's the only name they know. Don't you think the Sun has a responsibility in this matter to show who we should vote for?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that perhaps I'm an optimist in thinking that people will be able to make up their minds on their own, given the relevant and available information. And so I think we are also trying to prove a negative in a way in that we haven't seen the other situation. We haven't seen a world, at least in recent history in the Sun, where students were given the full amount of information and able to make up their minds on their own without an endorsement coming from the editorial board itself. So I think we ought to try it, for sure.
I don't necessarily think that's the Sun's job. And I feel like even if it were, endorsing candidates isn't necessarily the best way to guide people into the political process and mechanics of the student assembly at Cornell.
Okay. And what words would you give to your fellow student peers about voting in the SGA elections and how to inform themselves better?
Yeah. So as a graduate student myself, I'd have to say to all students, go and vote and do your research. Candidates, even though they are students and even though they are learning, should be open to the questions of their peers, especially when they purport to represent them on these assemblies. All of the assemblies are immediately relevant to all of us, and it's important that we not only digest the available material to us in forms of debates or candidate statements that are published, like the GPSA does candidate statements and they have bios and positions, that we analyze those and also take opportunities to go to town halls and go to meetings and be critical while also giving grace to the environment that we find ourselves in, which is that everybody's a student, that everybody's doing their best and also learning in the process and trying to make a better future for this university, which I think that everyone agrees with.
Yeah, I mean, again, I completely agree with that. I feel like he covers all of the great points for like every question, so that's amazing. But no, like actually, like very good point. I guess just like to go on a different note for that question, just remember the student assembly actually is way more important than we typically think so. There are lots of important resolutions that have been currently passed and resolutions in the past that really affect student life and how students feel on this campus, especially with you know, the increase in ICE arrests and what's happening across the world in the Middle East and Iran. So the Student Assembly is passing and is looking at a lot of resolutions that have to do with these major points that are typically not spoken about usually at this university because people just shy away from these topics. And it's important to get involved in the Student Assembly and what's happening just because they are looking at these resolutions and passing some of them that have a significant effect on our lives as students at this university.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and talking about this issue.
Yeah, thank you for having us.